She was shoved, insulted, and slapped in the face, all before the plane touched down, because she was black and dared to sit in first class. The flight attendant didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't even whisper an apology. Passengers stared like she didn't belong, like her presence up front was some kind of mistake. Every step of her journey was a slow-burn assault on her dignity. Her seat taken, her belongings tossed, her name ignored. No one knew who she really was. And that was their first mistake. Behind her silence was something far more dangerous than rage: restraint. This wasn't just a story about racism at 30,000 feet. It was a test, a trap, and they failed it in full view. Want to know what happened after the slap? Like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what would you have done if it was you in that seat? Naomi Delaney entered the jet bridge with a composed posture of someone raised to never cause disruption. She had booked the ticket weeks in advance, selecting seat 2A for the legroom and peace it promised. Her outfit was simple yet refined, a charcoal gray blouse tucked into cream slacks, her heels practical and clean. Everything about her suggested order, preparedness, and a desire to keep to herself. She moved without fanfare through the threshold into the plane's first-class cabin, nodding once to the greeting flight attendant. The lighting in the premium section was calm and buttery, the kind designed to lull wealthy passengers into a sense of importance. Naomi spotted her seat, took one step toward it, and froze. Someone was already sitting there. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled shirt and expensive-looking watch barely looked up as he fiddled with his smartwatch. Without a word, he adjusted his legs into her intended footwell and leaned back with a smirk. Naomi checked the number above the seat. It was clear. 2A. She rechecked her boarding pass, still certain. The number hadn't changed. The facts were simple. She had paid for this seat, and this man had not. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form the words, a flight attendant with short blonde hair and a too-wide smile appeared at her side. Her name tag read Renee. Her tone was clipped before Naomi even spoke. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked, arms crossed. Naomi held out her boarding pass and pointed toward the seat, stating the situation plainly. Renee took the pass between two fingers and glanced at it for no more than half a second before her eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. She didn't check a tablet, didn't verify. "I believe your seat has been reassigned," she said with a voice dipped in the kind of politeness that people use to close doors in others' faces. Naomi blinked. "There must be a mistake," she said, voice steady, measured. Renee sighed through her nose and leaned in slightly, not to whisper, but to make sure the words were delivered with private sting. "I can escort you to your new seat." Around them, several passengers had begun to shift, not in sympathy, but with the interest people give to minor inconveniences. Someone 2 rows back chuckled. Naomi turned her head and saw a man in golf attire whisper something to his wife. The woman gave a tight smile and looked away. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was purposeful. The message was clear. You don't belong here, and your presence is a disruption. Renee turned and led Naomi not through first class, but back down the aisle, each step accompanied by the hollow noise of disappointment echoing through Naomi's bones. The overhead lights in economy were brighter, harsher, less forgiving. They passed rows of families, businessmen, people scrolling on phones, all of whom barely lifted their eyes. Naomi was guided to row 28 and given the aisle seat beside a mother with 2 children and a tray full of open snacks. Renee offered no apology, no refund, no reason, just a nod and a comment. This seat should be sufficient. Naomi didn't respond. She sat down slowly, careful not to bump the toddler's juice box, careful not to wrinkle her blouse. She placed her carry-on under the seat and folded her hands in her lap. The air felt heavier here, less filtered. She heard the man in her original seat ask for a blanket and champagne, heard Renee laugh in response. The plane began to taxi. Naomi closed her eyes. Her chest rose and fell with deliberate rhythm. But under that quiet, a storm was beginning to gather, not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that burns slow and deep. She wasn't angry yet. She wasn't even hurt. She was still calculating. The ascent was smooth. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and trays began to descend. In first class, the soft clinking of crystal began to echo like music. In economy, a toddler cried. Naomi remained silent. Her hands didn't move. The attendants came by with lukewarm drinks in thin plastic cups. When she asked for water, the steward gave a nod and forgot about it entirely. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No one returned. Naomi didn't push the call button. She knew better. She sat there, back straight, eyes forward, lips set in a fine, sharp line. She had done everything right. Paid, planned, packed early. Yet here she was, a quiet anomaly in a row she had not chosen. All because someone decided she didn't look the part. An hour into the flight, she stood to stretch her legs. As she moved toward the restroom, she passed a row where a young woman gave her a once-over and clutched her handbag slightly tighter. Another man shifted his feet away as if avoiding contact. Naomi reached the lavatory, waited her turn, and returned to her seat. No eye contact, no acknowledgement. As she sat down again, a crumb from the toddler's snack tray landed on her lap. She brushed it away with a quiet grace that didn't match the place she'd been forced into. In her mind, she replayed the image of C2A. It was still hers. Her name was still associated with it in the system. She knew this, but none of it mattered. Perception had already taken hold. No one saw her as first class. Not Renee, not the man in her seat, not the passengers who saw her being ushered away like she was a mistake that needed fixing. She sighed quietly, straightened it manually, and folded her hands again. Her request for water had yet to be fulfilled, and Renee had passed her row 3 times since takeoff without once acknowledging her. Even when Naomi attempted to make eye contact during one of those passes, Renee's eyes moved past her, focused on a passenger 2 rows back who needed nothing, but was offered more anyway. Naomi turned toward the window and watched the clouds drift below, the calm outside betraying the quiet degradation she was enduring inside. 30 minutes later, a different flight attendant, this one younger and softer spoken, arrived with a beverage cart. Naomi looked up, offered a small smile, and asked once again for water. The young attendant, clearly nervous and trying to work quickly, handed her a small plastic cup filled only halfway. The water was warm, and the rim of the cup was slightly chipped. Naomi took it without complaint. She sipped slowly, the taste of neglect lingering behind the metallic tang of the liquid. Just as she placed the cup down, Renee's voice echoed from the front of the cabin, announcing that complimentary items would be distributed shortly to passengers in premium class. Another reminder of what she had lost, or rather, what had been taken from her under the pretense of protocol. Naomi didn't expect comfort in economy, but she hadn't expected punishment either. When the snack cart came through, she was bypassed entirely. She noticed this quietly. The mother beside her received a small bag of pretzels. The teenager in the aisle seat received 2. Naomi, hands folded in her lap, received nothing. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. But she watched as the cart continued down the aisle, as if she had ceased to exist. 10 minutes later, the young attendant returned and seemed to notice the oversight. She paused by Naomi's row, frowned, and rummaged through a compartment beneath the cart. What she retrieved was not a standard snack bag. It was a mismatched packet of stale crackers with a label partially torn off. She set it on Naomi's tray with a hushed apology and hurried off. Naomi glanced at it. The packaging had been opened and taped shut. She slid it aside and returned to the window. The child beside her began to fuss. The mother, clearly overwhelmed, tried to soothe the child with snacks and toys, but the noise rose steadily. Naomi did not complain. She understood travel was stressful for families. But Renee returned to their row with swift, decisive steps and stopped beside Naomi's seat, not to address the noise, but to speak directly to her. "Miss," she said, voice firm and false in its patience, "other passengers have mentioned you're creating some discomfort. I need to ask that you remain quiet for the duration of the flight." Naomi turned toward her slowly, disbelief flickering in her eyes. She hadn't spoken a word in nearly an hour. Her expression didn't change, but her voice was low and deliberate. "I've been silent this entire time," she said. Renee raised a brow and motioned toward a passenger two rows ahead who was pointedly not looking back. "Regardless," Renee continued, "please keep any further disruptions to a minimum." She offered no proof, no details, just insinuation and accusation stitched together with a condescending smile. The attention from the nearby passengers turned hot and prickling. Some glanced at Naomi and then quickly away. Others didn't bother hiding their discomfort. To them, a formal warning from a flight attendant was enough to confirm whatever story they needed to believe. Naomi sat straighter in her seat, said nothing, and watched as Renee walked away, satisfied. 10 minutes passed, then 15. A second attendant returned, the nervous one from earlier. She brought a tray with a single drink on it, ginger ale, no ice, slightly warm. She offered it with a gentle, apologetic expression. Naomi looked at the glass, puzzled. "I didn't order this," she said. The attendant shook her head. "Compliments of the passenger in 2A," she murmured, barely audible, before disappearing back down the aisle. Naomi stared at the drink. For a moment, she wondered if it was a peace offering, but the thought faded quickly. It was not kindness. It was mockery, an insult wrapped in politeness. The man in her original seat hadn't apologized, hadn't looked back, but he had ordered a drink on her behalf, sent it to the back like a king sending scraps to the peasantry. Naomi didn't touch the glass. She left it on her tray as the cabin lights dimmed and the temperature dropped slightly. She pulled her cardigan closer around her shoulders and turned again toward the window. A fine layer of fog gathered along the pane. Her reflection was faint, but still visible. She looked at her own face and searched for something she could name: anger, humiliation, sadness, but found none of those alone. Instead, she found a familiar expression, the one she wore in boardrooms, in elevators, in lobbies where others always hesitated before assuming she belonged. Hours passed. The flight crept by with calculated indifference. At one point, a young man across the aisle dropped his headphones. Naomi bent to pick them up and offer them back. He took them without a word, without eye contact, as though her hand had merely been a shelf. The plane hit a patch of turbulence and shook briefly. Passengers grabbed armrests. Some gasped. Naomi stayed still, motionless, her fingers intertwined. She had been through far worse storms than this. As the flight neared its final hour, the crew began preparing for descent. Passengers around her stretched, adjusted their belongings, shared idle conversation about the destination weather. Naomi remained silent. Her tray was collected without thanks. Her seat was checked without acknowledgement. She fastened her belt and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to remember everything. The flight landed with a soft thud. Passengers applauded politely, as if the flight had been an event worth celebrating. Naomi waited her turn. She did not stand immediately. She waited until the row ahead of her cleared, until the mother beside her had gathered her children and moved on. Only then did she rise, retrieve her bag, and step into the narrow aisle. She walked forward, row by row, passing the seat that had been hers by right. 2A was now empty. The man who had taken it had disembarked early. His privilege had carried him quickly, even off the plane. Renee stood at the front of the cabin, thanking passengers, her smile automatic. When Naomi reached her, Renee said nothing. Her eyes met Naomi's for a split second, then moved past her to the next traveler. She walked down the corridor with a straight-backed posture of someone who refused to give her tormentors the final satisfaction of seeing her falter. But inside, her dignity had been bruised by 1,000 invisible lashes. Her connecting flight was already listed on the monitor, Gate C-19. She moved without hesitation, choosing to walk rather than accept the courtesy cart that zipped past her, slowing briefly before continuing once its driver caught sight of her expressionless face. At the new gate, she stood quietly near the boarding zone, keeping her hands loosely clasped and her bag tucked neatly beside her. She had arrived early enough to board with the first group, and yet when the call for Group 1 came over the speaker, the gate agent avoided eye contact, calling Group 2 instead. Naomi approached the counter calmly, presenting her ticket with composed politeness. The agent scanned it and frowned without apology. "There's a delay in your boarding group," she said without explanation. Naomi's seat assignment had not changed. Her credentials were untouched. The delay, as always, came wrapped in invisible packaging: race, assumption, bias. There was no need to explain it aloud because it had already been spoken in 1,000 unsaid ways. When she finally boarded, she walked down the jet bridge as though it were a gauntlet. She entered the aircraft, this one smaller and narrower, and found her seat in row 3, another first-class reservation she had made weeks in advance. The cabin was arranged in 2 single columns along each side of the aisle, compact but sleek. Naomi set her bag beneath her seat, tucked her coat against the window, and settled into 3C. This time, no one tried to remove her. The flight attendant approached with a tight smile, her uniform pressed to precision, and handed her a small towel. Naomi nodded, but the woman did not offer the basket of complimentary snacks that she had visibly just handed to the passenger in 2C. She simply turned and walked away. Naomi dabbed her fingertips with a cool cloth and placed it carefully on the tray. Behind her, the slow parade of economy passengers filed past, many eyes brushing over her as they walked. Some offered indifferent glances. Others showed surprise. A few lingered with polite suspicion. One man, adjusting his backpack, stopped to look at her more openly and muttered, "Didn't know they let staff sit up here now." He chuckled as he passed, clearly amused by his own wit. Naomi didn't flinch. Her fingers curled once around the edge of her seat, then released. The plane lifted into the sky with ease, but Naomi's sense of dignity remained grounded, trampled by yet another passive insult. When the flight attendant returned to take her drink order, Naomi requested coffee. The attendant nodded, but returned minutes later with a lukewarm cup and a napkin smudged with someone else's lipstick. Naomi looked down at the napkin, then up at the attendant, who met her gaze with bland detachment and turned without waiting to see if the delivery was satisfactory. Naomi placed the napkin aside. The coffee, thin and bitter, barely tasted like itself. She drank half out of necessity, not preference. Across the aisle, a businessman asked for a fresh croissant and received one warmed, plated with fruit. Naomi was offered nothing. As the hours passed, the plane began its second descent of the day, and with it came another orchestrated insult. The flight attendant returned, this time holding a thin airline blanket in her hand. She looked at Naomi's seat and tilted her head. "Ma'am, we've had a report of a possible spill on this seat during the previous leg. For your safety, I'll need to place a protective barrier." Naomi stared at her, confused. She had not moved, not spilled anything, had barely spoken. The blanket was placed beneath her without further explanation, as if she were a liability needing protection. The implication stung sharper than words. She had been marked not as a valued guest, but as a problem to be managed discreetly. Once the plane landed and she disembarked, she made her way into the terminal restroom. Inside, she stepped into the farthest stall, dropped her carry-on carefully to the side, and locked the door behind her. She leaned against the cool metal for a moment, willing her chest to rise and fall with the kind of evenness that did not invite panic. She removed a handkerchief from her pocket, dabbed her forehead, and stared at the inside of the door. In this small, impersonal space, the quiet settled heavy. Not once had she spoken out loud. Not once had she objected. And yet she had endured slights that built one upon the other, like bricks forming a cage around her identity. When she exited the stall, she caught her own reflection in the mirror. Her eyes met her image directly. She straightened her posture, pulled back her shoulders, and adjusted her collar. There was no trace of emotional wreckage on her face, only control. Her final flight of the day was a red-eye back to her home city. Naomi arrived at the gate with time to spare, and this time her name was called over the loudspeaker before boarding. She approached the counter, uncertain. The gate agent smiled too brightly. "We're moving you to a different seat," she said. "You've been reassigned to the last row." Naomi's hand tightened slightly on the handle of her bag. "May I ask why?" she said, voice level. The agent's smile didn't falter. "Maintenance requested an adjustment to seat distribution. Just standard procedure." Naomi didn't argue. She took the new boarding pass and walked toward the rear of the aircraft when called. This time she was placed in 31E center seat, last row, non-reclining. The back wall of the aircraft pulsed with noise from the galley and restrooms. The air felt stale. The cushion beneath her sagged. She folded her coat behind her back for support, sat perfectly still, and counted the minutes in her head. The boy on her right leaned into her armrest repeatedly as he scrolled through videos without headphones. The woman on her left had claimed both shared armrests and had not once acknowledged Naomi's quiet attempts to shift politely. With her coat pressed behind her back to counter the stiff seat, Naomi sat upright, eyes forward, jaw set, her face unreadable. When the flight attendant reached their row, Naomi looked up, expecting at least a neutral greeting. Instead, she was met with a flicker of irritation and a single napkin tossed onto her tray. No drink, no snack, just a square of paper folded in half, as if she had already proven herself unworthy of anything more. The tray table itself jammed halfway down when she attempted to use it, and the flight attendant did not return when she quietly asked for assistance. As the cabin lights dimmed, the pilot's voice came through the overhead speaker, announcing that the seatbelt light would remain on due to turbulence. A rumble passed through the plane, light but enough to startle a few passengers. Naomi barely moved. She had been weathering worse storms in silence since the first leg of her journey. Moments later, another flight attendant arrived at her row. This one younger, his demeanor energetic, his eyes darting toward Naomi only briefly before he smiled broadly at the woman beside her and offered her a second drink. When the woman declined, he turned to Naomi, and in a performative gesture that seemed too exaggerated to be sincere, he said, "Anything for you tonight?" The tone was exaggeratedly cheerful, unnatural in its pitch. Naomi's response was calm and brief. She requested tea. He returned with a cup of hot water and a sealed bag containing a tea bag that was already torn along the side, leaking dried leaves into the tray. He set it down with a flourish and winked as if delivering a joke. The woman beside Naomi chuckled softly, and the boy on the other side glanced over with a smirk. Naomi said nothing. She picked up the torn tea bag and placed it neatly in the trash slot, choosing not to brew the tea at all. Later in the flight, the attendants began passing out blankets to passengers in aisle and window seats. Naomi, wedged in the middle and shivering beneath the aggressive air conditioning vent directly above her, was passed over. When she raised her hand slightly to call attention to the omission, the attendant paused, looked her over, and said flatly, "We're out of blankets." Less than 5 minutes later, a passenger 3 rows ahead, also in a middle seat, was handed one without asking. Naomi tracked the moment with still eyes and did not speak. Her hands remained folded. Her breath moved slowly in and out of her nose, calm but deliberate. The silence in her was beginning to take on weight, to shift from self-control into something else, something waiting. 3 hours into the flight, the cabin descended into a soft, blue glow. People began falling asleep, heads tilted against windows, bodies slumped with exhaustion. Naomi remained awake, posture unchanged, body still despite the discomfort. The boy next to her began snoring lightly, and the woman to her left pulled her scarf up around her head to create a makeshift hood, shielding her face. Naomi stared straight ahead. Then the lights came back up abruptly. The intercom buzzed once. Renee's voice filled the cabin, not with emergency, not with a necessary update, but with a strange announcement. Due to some unusual reports, we'll be conducting a quick walkthrough of select seats for safety compliance. Naomi blinked. There had been no disruption, no requests, no movement. Yet within minutes, 2 flight attendants approached her row, carrying clipboards. They stopped at her seat. "Miss, we've had a concern about improper seat usage and possible passenger discomfort." Naomi tilted her head slightly, brow furrowing. "Are you referring to me?" she asked. The attendant nodded and gestured for her to stand. With confusion now creeping into her voice, Naomi stood slowly. The attendants checked her seatbelt, inspected the tray, and examined the cushion below her. Then they pulled the seat back forward and, without explanation, applied a small sticker, an orange square used by maintenance crews to mark malfunctioning equipment. "Please remain standing for a moment," one said, stepping back. Naomi stood there, in full view of the surrounding passengers, who had begun peeking between seats, glancing sideways, watching silently. The boy beside her sat back with exaggerated care. The woman pulled her scarf lower and frowned in visible discomfort. Naomi remained upright, neither protesting nor sitting down until instructed. When the attendants finished their inspection, they offered no apology. "You may sit," they said, tone-clipped. As Naomi lowered herself back into the seat, the orange sticker remained just above her shoulder, a visual signal to anyone passing by that something about her seat, or perhaps about her, was defective. The humiliation didn't end there. 30 minutes later, the same attendant returned and crouched beside her seat. "We're conducting a mid-flight survey," he said. "Just a few questions about service so far." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, but she gave a tight nod. "Have any of our staff made you feel uncomfortable during this flight?" he asked. "Has anyone been disrespectful or treated you unfairly?" The question came not from concern, but from a place of condescension, a trap wrapped in courtesy. If she answered yes, she'd be marked as difficult. If she said no, her silence would be taken as compliance. Naomi considered her words carefully. "I've been treated exactly as expected," she replied, her tone flat. The attendant scribbled something on his pad and left without further questions. At the gate, the boarding area was nearly empty, save for a young couple whispering to each other and a businessman on his phone. Naomi approached the counter and presented her ticket. The attendant smiled too broadly, the kind of forced friendliness that preceded bad news. "Just a quick heads up," she said while tapping at her keyboard. "We've had to make a slight adjustment to your seat assignment." Naomi's face remained still. "What kind of adjustment?" she asked. The woman hesitated. "We've upgraded another passenger for loyalty reasons, so we've moved you just one row back. Still premium zone." Naomi took the new boarding pass and read the seat number, 12F. Not premium, not even economy comfort. Her eyes lingered on the attendant's face for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said flatly, then turned without protest. When boarding began, Naomi walked calmly down the aisle and reached her reassigned seat. It was beside the lavatory, close enough that the smell of disinfectant and recycled air was already leaking into the row. The armrest was loose, and the cushion had visible wear. She placed her coat in the overhead bin and sat. As passengers filled in around her, the overhead bins began to overflow. A man struggling with an oversized duffel muttered that her bag was in the wrong bin. "You people always think you can take whatever space you want," he grumbled under his breath. Naomi said nothing. She reached up, shifted her bag to allow his, and returned to her seat, eyes fixed ahead. The man gave a quiet snort and sat 2 rows back. 10 minutes later, Renee appeared again. Naomi had not expected her on this flight. Their eyes met, and for the first time, something flickered behind Renee's gaze, not surprise, not regret, more like annoyance that Naomi was still here, still moving, still enduring. Renee made a point of pausing by her seat. "We'll be conducting a luggage check in this row," she said, speaking as though to a child. Some bins were misused earlier. She opened the overhead above Naomi and pulled her coat free from its folded corner, dropping it onto Naomi's lap without care. Naomi picked it up slowly, brushed it smooth, and placed it across her knees. No apology, no explanation. After takeoff, as the seatbelt sign blinked off, Naomi reached into her bag to remove a bottle of hand cream. She squeezed a small amount into her palm, rubbed it across her fingers, and placed the bottle on the tray table. Within seconds, Renee returned. "Ma'am," she said sharply, "I'll need to confiscate any liquids not issued by the airline." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "It's under 3 ounces." Renee extended a hand. "Policy is policy." Naomi placed the bottle in her bag instead, ignoring the hand. Renee stood there for a beat longer, then walked away. A man across the aisle leaned in slightly, watching with interest. Later, when snacks were handed out, Naomi received a dry granola bar crumbled inside the wrapper. Her request for another was denied. "We have limited supplies," the attendant said, though Naomi had seen the cart stocked full minutes before. The air conditioning kicked on midway through the flight, aggressively cold and unfiltered. Naomi requested a blanket. "We're not offering those on this leg," came the reply. But 10 minutes later, a woman 1 row ahead received one. Naomi remained silent. The boy beside her, no older than 16, bounced in his seat while chewing loudly on gum. At one point, his elbow struck Naomi's arm hard enough to jostle her tray. "My bad," he muttered without turning. Naomi looked down at her arm, where a thin line of juice from the cup had spilled onto her sleeve. She dabbed it dry with a napkin and turned back to the window. She hadn't spoken a single word since the flight began. As the flight progressed, the lavatory line grew. People leaned across her seat. At one point, a man standing over her dropped his phone onto her lap. He retrieved it without apology. Naomi was not a passenger. She was an obstacle. During the second drink service, Naomi asked for ginger ale. The attendant poured it without ice into a cup already wet on the outside and placed it on her tray. When Naomi reached to adjust it, turbulence struck. The cup tilted, slid, and spilled across her tray, soaking her hands and splashing onto her slacks. She inhaled sharply but remained still. The attendant glanced over. "You should have held it properly," she said curtly, then handed Naomi 2 napkins, one already creased from another use. Naomi cleaned herself in silence, staring at the edge of the tray, willing the rest of the world away. 20 minutes before landing, the flight crew began cabin checks. Renee stopped at Naomi's row and pointed at her shoes. "Please remove those and store them under the seat." Naomi blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Is there a problem with them?" Renee nodded toward the floor. "We've had issues with certain styles causing scuff marks. Just procedure." Naomi slowly leaned down and removed her shoes, placing them neatly under the seat. She had worn them on every flight prior, without issue. She had worn them in corporate offices, at investor meetings, at speaking engagements. But here, now, they were an issue. Her stocking feet rested cold against the cabin floor. Renee walked away without further comment. The man 2 rows up glanced back with a small smirk. Naomi returned the look with blank precision. Just before landing, an announcement played. "We'd like to thank our premium passengers today, including Mr. Kenneth Braverman in 3A and Ms. Lydia Marsh in 5C. Your loyalty is appreciated." Naomi's name was not mentioned. It never had been. She had flown more miles this quarter than either of those names. But gratitude, like dignity, was reserved only for those deemed deserving. As the plane landed and passengers prepared to disembark, Renee returned one last time. "Hope everything met your expectations," she said with a thin smile. Naomi looked up at her, not with defiance or emotion, but with a cool neutrality that offered nothing in return. She rose, retrieved her coat, stepped into her shoes, and walked off the plane. She moved with the same careful dignity she had carried since her first boarding gate, but there was a new tension in her shoulders, not from fatigue, but from the final, quiet cruelty of being treated not only as lesser, but as invisible. The journey should have ended here, but as Naomi approached a private transport desk to confirm the last leg of her service, a black car reserved through corporate membership, another delay bloomed in her path like a wall too familiar to surprise her. The woman behind the counter, eyes still fixed on her screen, raised one hand without looking and said in a neutral tone, "Please wait to the side. Ma'am, we're currently prioritizing passengers with corporate clearance." Naomi placed her ID on the counter without speaking. The name on the card matched the reservation code blinking on the screen. The logo etched into the steel badge bore the name of the very airline group she'd been traveling with. The attendant looked at the ID, blinked, frowned, and tapped at the keyboard with a sigh that signaled irritation rather than concern. "I'll need to recheck this. Sometimes these memberships are entered incorrectly. It happens when someone books outside their tier." She handed the card back and motioned Naomi aside. A man in a wrinkled button-down and sports sneakers stepped up behind her, handed his card forward, and was immediately waved through. Naomi said nothing. She stepped to the side, as instructed, and waited. It was 15 minutes, before anyone acknowledged her again. During that time, 3 more passengers were greeted, confirmed, and ushered toward their vehicles. Naomi remained in view, her presence unnoticed, except as an obstacle. When the same attendant finally glanced her way again, her voice was slightly more irritated than before. "You're not with anyone, correct?" Naomi responded with a simple, "No." The attendant tapped again, sighed audibly, and said, "There must be a flag on your file. I'll need to speak with a supervisor." She made a phone call just out of earshot, her tone deliberately low, then hung up and returned with a small nod. "You'll need to go through the alternate exit. We've reassigned your car. Follow the red line on the floor to the lower terminal." Naomi's brow barely lifted. She took her coat and bag, turned without response, and walked toward the designated path, each step echoing off the sterile tile floor like footsteps down a corridor meant for those who needed to be removed without notice. The lower terminal was not empty, but it felt hollow. The air was colder, the fluorescent lights harsher, the seats sparse and worn. A security guard stood idly near the elevator. Naomi approached and offered her name. The guard pointed toward the far end of the hall, where an unmarked sedan idled with the engine running. "That one," he said, already turning away. Naomi walked to the vehicle. The driver stepped out only halfway, popped the trunk without eye contact, and returned to his seat. She loaded her own bag, closed the trunk, and entered the back seat in silence. The ride to the hotel was 20 minutes of static silence. The driver never asked for confirmation. He drove as if doing a favor. When they arrived, he didn't get out. Naomi stepped out, removed her bag, closed the door, and stood on the curb for a moment, watching the taillights disappear. Inside the lobby, the staff barely glanced up. The concierge skimmed her name and said, "Rooms prepaid. 2nd floor. Elevators down the hall." He handed her a key card and turned back to his computer. No offer of help with bags. No bottled water or welcome. Just another room. Another stop. Another unnoticed arrival. When Naomi entered the room, she locked the door behind her, placed her coat gently over the back of a chair, and set her bag beside the desk. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment. She looked at the bed, at the mirror, at the corner where the light didn't quite reach, and at the door she had just come through. The silence inside her had stretched across hours, flights, terminals, hallways, and now it filled the room like pressure before a storm. Her hands unbuttoned her blouse slowly, methodically, peeling it off to reveal the outline of the dried stain that had set into the fabric. She laid it across the bathroom counter and turned on the water. As the steam began to rise, she looked at herself in the mirror, not with pity, not with despair, but with something colder and far more dangerous than either. She washed her face, dried it with a towel, and redressed in a new set of clothes. Black pants, a fitted shirt, a tailored blazer folded perfectly in her bag for this moment. It was nearly midnight when she returned to the lobby and asked to use the business center. The night attendant looked surprised, but nodded and handed her a key. Naomi walked into the glass-walled room, powered on a computer, and began typing. The file she opened was not a spreadsheet. It was a corporate-controlled document with access reserved for one type of person, an internal auditing officer assigned to observe, investigate, and enforce conduct oversight. She logged in with credentials tied not to a passenger, but to a top-tier operative within the parent airline's executive trust. Not only had she booked the flights through a personal account tied to her name, but she had also logged every transaction, recorded every seating change, and tracked every staff member assigned to each leg of her trip. She had created the conditions for truth to emerge, not by declaration, but by behavior. She had documented her own mistreatment through their actions, and now the pattern was clear. Each moment of cruelty had not just been a coincidence or oversight. It had been systematic, layered, and facilitated by staff entrusted to uphold company standards. Naomi printed the relevant pages, folded them carefully, and placed them into a folder marked with a gold seal. She returned to the front desk and asked the night attendant to call for the hotel courier. "These need to be at the executive wing of the Eastbrook Aviation building by morning," she said calmly. The attendant nodded, unsure of who she was, but unwilling to question the authority in her tone. Her face, refreshed and calm, held no visible trace of fatigue or the bruises left by indignity. At the mirror, she affixed a small lapel pin, its dark metal surface embossed with the insignia of the Eastbrook Aviation Regulatory Consortium. The pin was subtle, unnoticed by most, but to those who understood its presence, it meant authority, oversight, and the power to dismantle entire departments. Naomi did not wear it as a badge. She wore it as a trigger. At 7:10 a.m. sharp, she entered the glass revolving doors of the Eastbrook headquarters downtown, passing through the marble foyer with the quiet familiarity of someone who had walked that path many times unseen. Security barely blinked as she moved past, flashing her credentials only once before entering the elevator. She was neither stopped nor questioned, not because she was recognized, but because she now moved through a system she had helped design. Her destination was the 12th floor, internal audits and ethics compliance, a suite of offices built to appear mundane, but tasked with the authority to investigate and discipline every operational tier within the aviation hierarchy, from local field agents to senior flight personnel. Naomi stepped out, greeted the receptionist with a brief nod, and entered a soundproof room marked Private Files Access. Inside, she placed her folder on the desk and began uploading her full report to the executive server. The data included timestamps, route logs, seating charts, flight crew rotations, and passenger service logs cross-referenced against recorded video from each gate checkpoint. Her summary statement was concise and final. Pattern of discriminatory behavior observed across 5 separate flights. Targeted passenger profile consistent with previous flagged incidents. Staff behavior indicative of uncorrected systemic bias. Recommendation: immediate executive review. Suspension of involved personnel pending further action. At 9:30 a.m., the report hit the inbox of Senior Director Malcolm Greaves, a man known for his icy disposition and rigid adherence to protocol. By 9:47, he had forwarded the report to the Ethics Division, flagged for executive discussion. By 10 o'clock, calls were being made. By 10:12, 3 names had been placed on emergency review. Renee Summers, lead cabin supervisor, Carla Denton, gate management staff, and Ivan Cummings, in-flight operations coordinator. At 10:26, their access cards were disabled. By noon, they were sitting in a conference room, not with passengers beneath them, but with investigators beside them. Naomi, meanwhile, did not attend the meetings. She didn't need to. Her role was not to prosecute. Her presence was the silent indictment. Instead, she stood in the observation corridor, separated by a single pane glass wall, where she watched the unfolding inquiries with the same neutral expression she had worn during every act of cruelty she had endured. Inside the room, Renee sat with her arms crossed, her lips set into a line that once passed as authority, but now looked defensive, brittle. She had not been told who filed the report. She had only been told that evidence existed, that it was sufficient, and that it had triggered a Category 3 review, a rare classification reserved for systemic, repeated, uncorrected violations of ethical conduct involving passenger treatment. When footage was played, Renee's expression shifted slightly. Naomi watched as each recorded moment was dissected. The refusal to check Naomi's first-class seat ticket, the dismissive tone, the deliberate reassignment, the smirking passenger who had been emboldened by her inaction, the cup delivered with the torn tea bag, the false security check, the final insult of removing Naomi's shoes under the pretense of scuff prevention. Later that afternoon, Naomi received a call from her administrative liaison. "They've requested a statement," the voice said. "Do you want to attend in person or submit remotely?" Naomi chose the latter. She recorded her statement in one continuous take, seated at a conference table, her voice measured, cool, her eyes never leaving the lens. "I experienced targeted and sustained disrespect across multiple flights operated under Eastbrook's Premium Fleet Division. I did not provoke, request, or consent to any deviation from standard treatment. At no point was I addressed with the professionalism or care expected of service staff trained under your guidelines. My silence was not an omission of awareness. It was a test, and your staff failed it." She ended the recording, attached it to her file, and left the room without waiting for acknowledgement. She passed by a wall of photos, portraits of department leads and board members. Her own name had never appeared on those walls. Her role had never been public. But that had never been the point. Influence, she believed, was most effective when no one knew it was watching. At 4 p.m., Naomi received word that a formal hearing was scheduled. She declined attendance. Her part was over. The weight of her silence had been transferred into documentation, into policy enforcement, into a language that could not be deflected with charm or twisted by pretense. Her silence had become procedure. She left the building the way she had entered it, silent, composed, overlooked by most, but recognized by the few who mattered. As she exited into the cold air, her phone buzzed with a message from Malcolm Greaves. It was short. Findings confirmed. Disciplinary proceedings initiated. Executive apologies pending. She closed the message and slipped the phone into her coat pocket. But Naomi didn't smile. There was no victory in this, only correction. The damage done couldn't be reversed, only acknowledged. The shame she had been forced to wear across 3 flights, 4 terminals, and 5 crews had not disappeared with the truth. It remained inside her not as bitterness, but as memory, a blueprint for how systems fail when power is unmonitored and cruelty is allowed to dress itself as efficiency. Her morning routine was precise and unchanged. She washed, dressed, packed her bag, and zipped the compartments with quiet efficiency. She did not linger in front of the mirror. She no longer needed to see her reflection to confirm her control. The identity that had been hidden behind silence, patience, and intentional stillness had now surfaced and left its mark. The lapel pin remained on the inside pocket of her blazer, no longer displayed. Its purpose had been fulfilled. By 8:30, she entered the Eastbrook Aviation Building once more, but this time not to observe or to submit documentation. She was scheduled to meet the interim disciplinary panel, 3 senior executives, who had convened an emergency session following the overnight conclusion of the internal review. Unlike traditional reviews where discussions were kept within closed executive circles, this one had been marked as visible to department heads from across compliance, diversity, field operations, and legal counsel. A response was demanded not only by the internal report, but by the weight of her authority now made visible. When she entered the conference room, the atmosphere stiffened. The panel members rose automatically, unsure whether to greet her as peer, witness, or superior. Naomi took her seat without ceremony. She set a thin leather portfolio on the table, removed a tablet, and opened a series of annotated files. There were no introductions. The air didn't permit it. Senior Director Greaves began with a statement. We have reviewed the sequence of interactions and found repeated failures in standard operating procedures, violations of conduct, and unprofessional treatment extending across departments and personnel tiers. Your report was complete, supported, and corroborated. We have taken initial disciplinary action and are now in deliberations for full formal response. We are also considering public acknowledgement. Naomi listened without comment, her eyes steady, fingers motionless on the surface of the tablet. Would you like to address the room? He asked. She nodded once, closed the file, and looked directly at the assembled panel. This was not about a seat or a snack, she began, voice low and unhurried. It was not about misplaced courtesy or a single individual's poor judgment. This was about an entire culture that believes it can predict worth based on appearance. This was about trained staff choosing over and over to make assumptions instead of offering service. This was about watching a quiet passenger and deciding that silence meant inferiority. The treatment I received was not exceptional. It was routine. That's why it mattered. She paused, letting the quiet hang. One of the department heads shifted awkwardly, glancing at his notes. This investigation was not just a test, she continued. It was a measurement. Your systems failed it. Your personnel failed it. And now the response must exceed the offense. She then handed the portfolio across the table. Inside were recommendations: mandatory retraining with enforced oversight, performance evaluation tied to real-world feedback from randomized assessments, and the removal of 3 personnel from all customer-facing roles pending psychological and ethical reevaluation. The panel did not speak. They read. Naomi stood, not waiting for acceptance. You asked if I would address the room. I just did. She walked out, her presence trailing behind her like a storm's receding pressure. She passed through the corridors lined with polished steel and blue carpet, no longer observing, no longer cataloging, now walking as the catalyst, whose calm dismantled an architecture built on selective blindness. At noon, the public internal memo was released. It bore the Eastbrook Aviation seal and a bland subject line, Notice of Policy Review Update. But its content was far from bland. The document detailed the findings of Naomi's report in general terms and outlined the actions being taken. Names were withheld, but consequences were clearly outlined. A separate message followed an hour later from the president of Eastbrook Global, addressed to all senior staff. Our institutions are only as strong as our willingness to hold ourselves accountable. Effective immediately, a new initiative will launch to ensure equity, dignity, and integrity are preserved at every level of our operation. By 2 o'clock, the story had begun to spread within industry circles. Words like internal exposure and accountability shift began appearing in emails and quiet conversations. Naomi's name was never mentioned publicly, but her presence was felt everywhere the memo was read. Back at the hotel, her checkout process was swift. The same staff who had once ignored her now stumbled over themselves to offer assistance. A fresh car was waiting outside, sleek, clean, driven by someone who opened the door without delay. Naomi thanked him with a single nod. She entered the vehicle and watched the city blur past her window, its skyscrapers tall but no longer imposing. She did not feel triumphant. She felt precise. This moment wasn't a climax. It was a hinge, a point on which the door of consequence had begun to turn. At the private terminal, the staff greeted her by name. A woman stepped forward, offering to assist with check-in. Naomi handed over her credentials, which now bore not only her name, but a status designation that instructed discretion and respect. The boarding gate was empty, reserved. Her seat was confirmed and unchanged. First class. No reassignment. No confusion. No avoidance of eye contact. As she boarded, the flight attendant greeted her with a tone of measured formality. Naomi offered a brief smile, not warm, not cold, simply factual. She took her seat, placed her coat beside her, and reclined with quiet finality. Her mouth opened, but the words that followed were not defensive. They were weak, uncertain. I followed protocol, she muttered. The panel remained still. Protocol does not include discriminatory discretion, the chairwoman replied flatly. You were recorded dismissing a first-class passenger's verified seat assignment, facilitating unnecessary downgrades, and engaging in targeted disrespect that contravenes not only policy, but the basic standards of ethical conduct. Renee looked toward the corner of the room, as if seeking a window, an escape, a reset. None came. In another wing of the building, Carla Denton, the gate supervisor who had reassigned Naomi's boarding pass without cause, faced her own interrogation. Unlike Renee, Carla had not realized the gravity of her actions until the evidence had been presented in sequential clarity. Camera angles, time-stamped logs, audio snippets, where her condescension was unmistakable. She shifted in her seat, sweat beginning to dampen her collar. I didn't know who she was, she said, voice cracking. If I had known, the investigator cut her off with a raised hand. So you're saying if she had status, or if she had identified herself as an executive auditor, your treatment would have changed? Carla froze. She had walked into the room, believing the worst outcome would be suspension. Now she understood that the damage done extended beyond policy. It had entered the domain of corporate liability, of personal accountability, of professional collapse. Her job was not merely in jeopardy. Her career was. Meanwhile, Ivan Cummings, the flight operations manager who had signed off on crew rosters and facilitated cabin crew adjustments on the final flight, had received notification of an executive hearing to be conducted by the Ethics Oversight Committee. He arrived wearing a suit that hung too loose and carried a file stuffed with explanations. But excuses had no oxygen in this space. The committee read directly from the compiled report. You approved changes that placed a high-tier passenger in a seat located beside the rear lavatory. You ignored formal complaints and authorized a crew override of beverage protocols without verification. Ivan shook his head, the words rising quickly. I just signed off based on what they told me. I had no reason to question them. The director leaned forward. You had no reason to ask why a verified elite traveler was moved to the lowest-ranked seat available? No reason to question why her onboard requests were denied repeatedly. Ivan's silence arrived too late to be strategic. The committee recorded his failure to respond. They informed him that pending final review, he would be placed on indefinite administrative leave with restrictions on future operational approvals. His career, once protected by familiarity and quiet compliance, had been punctured by his own negligence. Each individual who had played a role in Naomi's sequence of public humiliation now faced accountability, not just through reprimand, but through exposure. Their names were circulated internally on a confidential list of personnel under disciplinary review. They lost access to internal systems, their clearance levels downgraded, their professional reputations whispered about in hallways they once walked with confidence. What had once been jokes exchanged in backrooms, dismissive chuckles over coffee after difficult passengers, were now framed in internal memos as examples of unchecked bias and operational misconduct. The consequences were not abstract. They were immediate, visible, and permanent. Elsewhere in the company, ripple effects began to spread. Departments began calling emergency staff meetings to rebrief team leads on conduct protocols. Compliance officers were assigned to monitor boarding interactions on high-value flights. A new checklist was implemented, one that required formal verification steps before any seat reassignment or service denial. Flight attendants were pulled into retraining modules that no longer treated customer experience as optional professionalism, but as core responsibility tied directly to quarterly evaluations. For many, the name Naomi Delaney was never mentioned, but they heard about her in the tone of meetings, in the urgency of policy rewrites, in the unusual silences that followed questions once asked without consequence. Meanwhile, Naomi remained deliberately absent from the swirl of attention now circulating within the corporate walls. Her presence was no longer required. Her actions had already spoken. Instead, she sat at a high-rise restaurant near the airport, alone at a corner table overlooking the airfield. She drank coffee, black, the same way she had asked for it on that first flight, the one where her request had been ignored and replaced by indifference. Now, every attendant working that route had received updated instructions. Her choices, her silence, had authored change that reached beyond those responsible for her mistreatment. The system had been forced to turn its gaze inward. At that moment, inside an off-site training facility, Renee was seated in a mandatory corrective ethics session. The room was quiet, filled with others whose offenses ranged from minor infractions to serious policy violations. A facilitator played a recording, a dramatization based on real incidents. As it played, Renee's eyes widened. The voice on the recording matched her own words. Not recreated, not exaggerated. Her exact tone, her phrasing, her laughter in the aisle. The room turned to look at her. No one spoke. The moment lasted only seconds, but it dissolved whatever self-righteous shield she had clung to. When the lights came back up, she looked down and did not lift her head again. Carla received her own notice of transfer later that day. Not a suspension, but a relocation to a regional outpost known for its low traffic and difficult schedules. Her badge had been recoded. Her supervisor reminded her gently that her position was being preserved only under the condition of full performance review within 3 months. She nodded, humiliated, still trying to understand how a quiet woman in a neat gray blouse had undone her entire career trajectory without raising her voice once. 3 months had passed since the disciplinary hearings concluded, since the internal memos reshaped how Eastbrook Aviation treated its own policies, and since Naomi Delaney returned to her life, not with fanfare or celebration, but with the stillness of someone who had completed something necessary. The world didn't shift overnight, and the people who had humiliated her weren't erased from it. But what had changed was now embedded in the operations, in the culture, in the quiet habits that determined whether passengers were treated as burdens or as people. Naomi never sought vengeance. Her goal had never been punishment. Her silence had never been about fear. It had been about control, and what she had done with it, what she had built in the space between humiliation and justice, was a kind of reckoning that demanded reflection, not applause. She moved forward, but behind her, the story continued. Renee Summers, once a lead cabin supervisor known for her strict tone and brisk disregard for passengers she deemed difficult, now worked on the overnight regional route between Atlanta and Charleston, a short hop usually assigned to new staff or those placed under review. She wore a simplified uniform without the stripes that once designated her seniority. The first few weeks were difficult. Passengers remembered her differently. Staff whispered when she entered the crew lounge. But what changed her wasn't the assignment or the stairs. It was a single flight with an elderly passenger, a black woman in her late 70s, traveling alone for the first time in years to attend her granddaughter's college graduation. The woman struggled with her seatbelt. She apologized too often. She seemed afraid to ask for help. And when Renee brought her a blanket and adjusted her seat, the woman looked up with surprised eyes and said, "I thought you were going to ignore me." That single sentence rang in Renee's head for days. It echoed not just with guilt, but with recognition. Because she had ignored someone. She had chosen not to see Naomi Delaney. And now she saw echoes of Naomi everywhere. In quiet passengers with good posture, in women who packed neatly and moved carefully so they wouldn't disturb others. The work was humbling. But slowly, Renee began doing more than following rules. She started listening. She offered help before it was asked. She watched body language, not just boarding passes. And for the first time in years, she began to remember why she'd entered service in the first place. Carla Denton, once a gate supervisor who treated schedule changes like personal power plays, found herself stationed at a minor regional airport in upstate New York. There, the foot traffic was slow, the weather unpredictable, and the resources limited. She arrived on her first day with a chip on her shoulder, prepared to blame everyone except herself. But the isolation did something to her. In the absence of a bustling team, she was forced to do the work herself. She checked tickets, handled complaints, answered questions without delegation. And with each day, her excuses weakened. She thought often of the moment she dismissed Naomi's boarding pass with a rehearsed line and no effort to verify. She remembered the look on Naomi's face, calm, restrained, but filled with something heavier than disappointment. She began to replay her actions not as defensible logistics, but as failures of character. Over time, her defensiveness gave way to introspection. She no longer saw compliance as a shield. She began to see it as a floor, not a ceiling. And in quiet moments, when the terminal was empty and the fluorescent lights hummed softly above her desk, she wondered if she'd ever have the chance to apologize to the woman whose quiet dignity had exposed the small cruelty Carla had grown too comfortable inflicting. Ivan Cummings spent those same months away from the operations floor, his access permanently revoked. He had taken on a reassigned role in logistics, working remotely to coordinate regional crew schedules. It was monotonous work, but in that stillness, in the absence of noise and hierarchy, Ivan finally read the full report that had led to his removal. He read Naomi's statement over and over, not just her summary, but her description of the small, relentless humiliations she had endured. And what struck him most was not her critique of policy, it was her lack of anger. She had laid out the facts without embellishment. She had not weaponized her authority. She had simply held up a mirror. For the first time, Ivan stopped defending his role. He admitted to himself that his inaction had allowed the system to breathe freely in its own arrogance. He began attending optional equity briefings offered by the company. He started listening to training recordings from other departments, not because he was told to, but because he wanted to understand the damage of what he hadn't questioned. His remorse was not performative. It was internal, slow, and real. Naomi, meanwhile, received no updates. She didn't ask for them. She had returned to her position quietly, continuing to conduct audits, to write reports, to observe the system not with bitterness, but with the precise calm that had become her signature. But one day, she received a handwritten letter delivered through internal mail. It was short, written in steady script. The name at the bottom was Renee Summers. The letter did not excuse, explain, or minimize. It simply read, "I understand now, and I'm sorry." Naomi held the paper in her hand for a long time. She did not smile. She did not tear up, but she folded it once, carefully, and placed it inside a file marked Internal Change Initiatives. The system wasn't perfect. It never would be, but people could change. If they were willing to look inward, to admit harm, to let discomfort lead to growth, then even the most flawed institutions could be reshaped by human choice. The final chapter of this story did not end with an award, a headline, or a promotion. It ended with a system that had learned, however slowly, to check itself. It ended with employees who now hesitated before speaking, who verified before assuming, who respected without condition. It ended with a woman who had walked through humiliation without shouting, who had transformed silence into action, who had made those who mistreated her confront the truth, not because she raised her voice, but because she refused to lower her standards. The message left behind was not about vengeance. It was about responsibility. That respect is not a privilege to be earned by appearance or title. It is a baseline of humanity owed to all. And those who withhold it build the walls of their own downfall, brick by quiet brick, until someone like Naomi walks through not with fire, but with precision, and leaves nothing untouched. The end. If you've made it this far, thank you for reading. If the story resonated with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the plot so far. What part hit hardest for you? Do you think the shift in the characters was believable? Also, tell me, where are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Your feedback shapes where the story goes next.